We we're so pleased to be back here with you. It's been a while since we've all been together and had a chance to talk. We have a very interesting program for you this evening. We're going to be talking about some of the great geniuses in the black community. Um, Brothers and sisters who did more individually for the liberation of African people, for making sure that they how should I put this? We have two brothers that we want to talk about this evening. That's Brother Booker T. Coleman, Booker T. Brother Booker, George Washington Carver, and Brother Booker. Um, what's his name, Tyre?
I couldn't
Are
hear
you
you.
there, Tyre?
I only
No,
could hear pieces of what you're saying, but okay. It's low.
no. I was saying we wanted to talk about two great African brothers who did
Right.
more on an individual basis to liberate African people from oppression, from racism and segregation, and to restore them to health and leadership. And these two brothers, their contributions were greater than all the entire U.S. government. We're going to be talking about that. Their contributions to the liberation of African people were greater than um, the contributions of the entire government of the United States. And so, just before we get into Booker Washington, I want to say that um, African soldiers, the colored troops, were responsible for the the winning of the war, the Confederacy. It was African troops at New Market Heights that literally captured Richmond, Virginia, and ran Robert E. Lee out of there and recaptured him again at Appomattox. And that great victory, they had to accomplish that. Their their weapons actually, because if they had stopped to load their mustards and things, they could not have gotten up the hills. And uh, the attack on Richmond had to be one in which they practically had to run over a quarter of a mile and just overwhelm the Confederacy and bayonet them to death. And it's one of the greatest stories on African contributions in the Civil War. Of course, couldn't have won the Civil War without the 230,000 uh, black troops that was in the Civil War. So, but that's that's not the focus tonight. The focus is on Booker Washington and George Washington Carver. But before I get into George Washington Carver, I want to bring my sister, Dr. Tyra Wright, to talk about uh, George Washington Carver because it was through George Washington that Tuskegee Institute was formulated. And that is one of the greatest institutes of,
I'm gonna
of
turn
that.
something down.
Yeah. So I just wanted her to talk about what that institute meant to us as
Okay.
a people and how it fits into our liberation struggle. So, Dr. Wright, thank you for being on with us tonight. And I want you to go ahead on and talk about Booker T.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Brown. Uh, I'm having a little bit. So I was turning the air condition down because I was having a little bit of trouble hearing you clearly. I don't know if there's a way we can improve the sound. But can you all hear me clearly? It's fine.
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so you wanted me, yes, Booker T. Washington and both George Washington Carver from the same institution made major contributions to the welfare and the social development of the African people in the United States. Probably in a way that few have made, only because I think that, in that particular time period, there was an emphasis on advancing political and social rights right out of the end of right out of the end of radical reconstruction and a desire to invoke political rights. And so there was an emphasis on that. But Booker T. Washington would advocate for the material advancement, economic advancement. And George Washington Carver was sort of part of the program in terms of developing Tuskegee as a model, not just for the institution, but for what they could offer African communities, right? So a lot of the agricultural practices, even the very concept that agricultural practices that are developed there should be shared with the community, and so on and so forth, right? So yes, they both made a significant contribution, and it's not a coincidence that they are bound together by this common institution, right? Because some of what George Washington Carver would do, and most of what Booker T. Washington would do, would be in line with this concept of sustainability.
Okay. One of the things that a lot of people may not understand, when it comes to George Washington Carver, he he was one of the brightest minds on planet Earth. In fact, Henry Ford said that he was the greatest scientist in the world. That was Ford, and Thomas Edison tried to pay um, George Washington Carver $100,000 in the early 40s to work with him to help develop products from peanuts. Uh, it was uh, 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 George Washington Carver. Um, just to give a little background, he was born in slavery, and his mother and himself and his brother was was kidnapped, and they were able to find his brother and himself, George Washington Carver, but they never could find his mother. Now, George Washington Carver he was a poet, he was an artist, he was a prolific artist, and he was considered to be such a great mind and had the ability to talk to plants. Uh, and it said that he could go out into the forest and spend the day talking with plants and come back with all kinds of medicinal medications that would help heal the community. His whole focus was on healing uh, black people. George Washington Carver had a PhD. Um, he was literally the assistant uh, to the president of agriculture. Um, he literally saved the South. The South um, was suffering from uh, the inability of understanding that you have to rotate crops in order to get the nutrients from the different plants so that you wouldn't exhaust uh, the nutrients. And one of the major plant sources from George Washington Carver was a peanut. He He brought about over 350 different products from the peanut alone. And he could go out into the forest and literally talk to the plants about uh, what he needed to get from them in order to improve the health, not only of the soil, but of the people themselves. His commitment was to heal black people and teach them how to be self-sufficient, and that all of these different plants that he was able to understand um, he was a horticulturist. Um, he brought about an understanding of nature. It is said that any any question that the mind was seeking an answer for, George Washington Carver, because of his oneness with nature, could therefore find the answer to any question that the mind could conceive. Um, it could be answered through his understanding and his oneness with nature. And that is why uh, everybody, even presidents, he was assistant to the president of the United States in agriculture. There was nothing that they wanted to understand that people did not search out George Washington Carver for answers. I mean, we never think of him as being one of the most brilliant men on earth, but he also is given credit for saving the South not only from its overexertion of cotton, but of the boll weevil. The boll weevil literally ravaged the South. That's that the boll weevil is the only insect that a monument was built to. They built a monument. Now they didn't build a monument to George Washington. Yeah, boy, that's not true. They built plenty of monuments to George Washington Carver, but they built one to the boll weevil as well. Now I can say this: they never. Uh, there were 27 Nobel prizes given out for science, but nobody never gave George Washington Carver uh, a Nobel Prize for science, even though there were no greater scientists that anybody could point to on planet Earth. But of course, white people were not about to give a black man a Nobel Prize in science. Now they give Nobel Prizes in peace, but not in science. And Booker
Mhm.
was the greatest scientist ever produced in America, uh, any place else in the world. Uh, and he's given credit for these things. I mean, there's some 20 something documentaries that are made just of George Washington Carver and his contributions to humanity. George Washington Carver was not, he he tried to help everybody really. He wasn't a racist, anything of that nature. He was a humanitarian, uh,
Mhm.
and his focus was on moving humanity into a greater position of being able to get along together, and therefore bringing about uh, a much greater ability to survive as a people.
Mhm.
And that was why he was considered um, one of the greatest intellects because of his ability to uh, to find himself one with nature, and any question that the mind could conceive, nature could answer. And Booker T was one with nature. So he
Or
was just a,
Carver.
yeah, he was just the greatest mind. But we don't know these things. We don't know um, how black people have been responsible, and that's why I wanted to start out with Booker Washington, because you
Uh-huh.
can't talk about Booker Washington without talking about um, our great liberator, um, who wanted to take us back to Africa. As a matter of fact, last time I was in Africa, the Black Star adorned the uh, the field where the military, uh, comes out to practice and everything. But before you can get there, you have to go under the Black Star, which is Marcus Garvey. And those two men, I'm just talking about those two men. Yeah, I'm not talking about the thousands of black folk who brought about all kinds of contributions that have led America to be great. Because America's wealth could not be without African people. I mean,
Right.
it's a wealthy place, but only because of the enslavement of African people. And African people brought about really civilization, just about anything in civilization that you want to talk about, whether it's mathematics, whether it's the building of pyramids, whether it's writing, whether it's trigonometry, government, I don't care what it is. You
Mhm.
have to put that foundation to African people, you know. So I just wanted us to talk a little bit this morning about our greatness. And when we know that greatness, when we know that greatness, there is nothing that can stop us from rising again. It's our time. I mean,
Right. Well, it is. It is.
yeah.
But
So I would like for you to talk about that, our time. This is 26,000 years that we have, the 26,000 year calendar is in effect right now. And that's the calendar of the time of Kephas, which is
mhm.
the rise of the black man, the Ethiopian star. It's on the horizon. And that's what what all this is about. They don't. They're like, oh, can't let these people know who they are. I mean, can't let them, really rise, because if they rise, it might be another 26,000 years before we get back into power. So, Tyra, thank you for listening at me, and I just want to give you the opportunity to expand on this, because George Washington, um, Booker T was a great African. So so was um, so was George Washington Carver, but Booker T in particular was one of great Africans. Could you talk on it?
Yes, yes. So, well, if the audience doesn't know, so I should say the reason why you're asking me to speak about Booker T. Washington is because I wrote a book called Booker T. Washington and Africa, about Washington's clandestine life and role in Africa and in African affairs, and certainly his role in two very important policy cases that changed U.S. foreign policy as it related to uh, Liberia, in which case it was a crisis in 1907 to 1912, where Booker T. Washington, is a key negotiator. And then also later on, in a even more, or not even more, but just as significant of a case, which is called the African Exclusion Measure, which took place in 1915, where Washington impacts U.S. Immigration policy as it relates to African and the Black population. but also in the context of my work, I give you a full discussion of how he comes to understand Pan Africanism, how the role he plays in Pan Africanism in the world at that time as it's just emerging around 1900, his role in the first Pan African conference. I give a little truth about the dynamics between Du Bois and Washington and dispel a couple of myths about their relationship. Um, and so that's why, you know, you are asking me to speak on Booker T. Washington. Now, what I'm not an expert on, so I am an expert on Washington's role in Africa, which is a very obscure, narrow area and field, which not a lot of people have touched, right? Um, but I'm not an expert on his role in the United States. I just have a significant amount of knowledge about some of his interactions here as a result of studying his clandestine life, right? So it's almost by proximity that I have some information or some firsthand understanding in terms of research and documents that I've seen and studied that I can give some opinion about his posture here in the United States. uh, but also, too, Washington was doing something here in the United States that he had every intention of exporting to Africa and throughout the African world. So let me say that. What allows me to say all of what I just said is the fact that Washington's personal papers were opened up in the 1970s, and he died in 1915. So in the 1970s, the Library of Congress had a man named Lewis Harlan go in and preserve some of Washington's personal papers. However, those, it's a massive collection, 15 volumes, each volume around 300 to 500 pages of correspondence to and from Washington with various people, both domestically and internationally. But today, there is said to be at least 1,000 boxes of his personal papers that are still unedited. And even the papers that were edited, they were edited by a person who is deeply problematic in terms of um, documenting the historical facts around Washington, his life, his position, and that was Lewis Harlan, right? Lewis Harlan was a white American male scholar, academician, historian who came to the study of Washington's life and work with an unbelievable bias against him. And he went on record with that bias. However, he made a whole career off of talking about Washington, writing two biographies, writing numerous articles, and editing Booker T. Washington's personal papers. Right. So most of what we know in the public realm about Booker T. Washington is skewed and distorted and has been distorted by Lewis Harlan primarily, as he was allowed to have an uninterrupted monopoly on the interpretation of Booker T. Washington, which we should have interrupted, right? Meaning Black and African scholars who had the courage to touch Washington. So most of this accommodationist and all these other terms that are used in reference to Washington have been largely been utilized and implanted, planted in our communities and our thoughts by people like Lewis Harlan, namely. Okay, but there's a whole line of scholars who would come in the same vein as Harlan and write 100 years history, pretty much maligning Booker T. Washington, all to really get most of us away from this understanding of what Washington was doing and what Tuskegee truly was, which is a self-sustaining African community. Okay, much like many at that time. This one masqueraded as a school. Okay, let me just give you a real brief quote, and then I'll get more specific because I know you want me to speak on some specific things like Carver, uh, um, Marcus Garvey, and his relationship and how that comes about. But this gives you an idea right now of why they would even want anything to do with Tuskegee. And what Washington was up to. Washington was trying to perfect a sustainable model that he could, for African people, that he could export to the rest of the world, throughout the rest of the world, throughout the African world specifically. We must understand that Tuskegee is founded right after radical reconstruction has ended. So radical reconstruction in this country is ended in 1877. Tuskegee is established in 1881. Very interesting story of its founding, which I won't get into, but Booker T. Washington is not the conceptual founder. That's Lewis Adams, who was a formerly enslaved person who initiates the founding of Tuskegee as a result of a political favor he does for the incumbent senator. But point being, Washington was trying to perfect sustainability, and that's something that this is still a timeless conversation because what every African nation or Black nation suffers under is not being sustainable, not owning the industries that exist in their country. So, in other words, pigeonholed into producing uh, just raw materials and having your economy exploited, right? Because the European market decides what they're going to pay, right? And they all decide that they're not going to pay much for raw materials, and so those industrial plants that process these raw goods material are not in our possession, in our ownership, and so we are pigeonholed into producing raw materials, ship it out, they put it in a box or a can with some salt, send it back to us, and we pay the tax on it to consume the very things that grow below our feet, right? And and this is how nations and communities are exploited, right? So Washington knew this. At Tuskegee, there were 44 industries, but I don't want you to think that Tuskegee was unique. What's unique about Tuskegee is that it was also a school. It masqueraded as a school. But there were a large number, and I keep saying this, and I've got to get to it myself, that there remains to be written a book, a comprehensive book on the independent, sustainable African communities that existed in the United States post the Civil War. There were many, there were numerous. I've done a couple of interviews where I've talked about some. Most people know about Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but that was the least of them. That was actually the last of them. There were many, you know. You know, I'm trying to think of Mount Bayou off the top of my head, but there's a lot of sustainable Black communities. What has stopped that or interrupted that is the fact that we live in a very violent country. And so when the class of people who were formerly enslaved and had all the skill sets in every industry were finally free, we were finally free to put all of those skills to use for ourselves. And so we were certainly capable of building a house, right? Maintaining agricultural life, engaging in subsistence farming, on and on and on. So you had a large number of independent, sustainable Black communities or industrial Black communities. Tuskegee is one of the ones that was established as a school. And so let me give you just a blip in my book what one of the journalists who was paying attention to what was happening at Tuskegee said about it. And then I'll give you something that a critic said about Tuskegee. Thomas Dixon, who did not like the idea that African people were engaging in the sustainable communities. But this is what Arthur Evans wrote about Tuskegee. This is an article called Working Out Race Problem, and it's by Arthur Evans, staff correspondent of the Chicago Record Herald. And he says, a school, Tuskegee is not a school in the ordinary sense of the word. It's a city in itself, a community that dominates a whole county. It's a great industrial plant with 40 trades and industries that consumes all its own products, that erects its own buildings, first making its own bricks, that grows its own food, makes its own clothes, writes and prints its own textbooks, all by way of education. And so, in other words, this is not simply a school. This is a sustainable community that has 44 industries that can provide all the necessities for a man, woman, and child. And so, what Washington did was implement a curriculum for a school that was not an industrial school. It was a school for teachers that had two, that where you could learn the academics and then master two industries so that you could go on and teach those two industries. And so that's what Tuskegee was. Um, and Washington understood that it would be through the graduates of this institute that these sustainable practices could be shared with the African world. And one of the offshoots of this would be um, the International Conference on the Negro in 1912. This is a significant conference because this conference would open up Tuskegee's 44 industries to African people on the continent of Africa, African people in the Caribbean, Central and South America, as there were always a steady flow of students from the African world. Okay, when I say the African world, some people are like, what is she talking about? Caribbean, Central, South America, and the African continent. The African world, everywhere Africans, the scattered African people are, right? That's what and I'm using that as sort of invoking Booker T. Washington's own words as well, okay? Um, so he opens up these 44 industries for everyone to come and observe and take away some of the best practices that they observe there. And at this particular conference, the first of its kind in 1912, there were people from all over the world, but notably, there were 8 educators who came from the island nation called Jamaica. And they would get a chance to see these 44 industries in practice there. And they were able to take the word back to Marcus Garvey. But also at this particular conference, one of the resolutions of the conference was to erect a Tuskegee-like school in Jamaica. So when you see in the historical records, if you ever read anything about Marcus Garvey, you know prior to coming to the United States, Marcus Garvey is moving around the Caribbean attempting to raise money for a school. What school? This school that's in the resolutions of the 1912 International Conference on the Negro. It is Washington Conference, and it is very Pan-African in nature because it's meant to look at our condition and use the 44 industries as methods to sustain ourselves in a hostile world, right? Nation management and nation building skills are what are under observation there. So these 8 educators go back to Jamaica, share what they have seen at Tuskegee, as well as the conference resolutions. And Marcus Garvey, who was already aware of Booker T. Washington, he had read his autobiography and said, that reading his autobiography, Booker T's autobiography, had informed him of his doom to be a race leader.
Yes.
And so now here he has an opportunity to make firsthand contact with Washington upon return of these 8 educators that attended the International Conference on the Negro. Garvey initiates correspondence with Booker T. Washington for the first time in 1912. Okay.
Yes.
And they would have several years of communication until Washington's untimely death in 1915. Some of the things they would talk about would be uh, the criticism they both received from Black people who were critics of them in the public realm, as Garvey had his critics in Jamaica who were Black but not aligned with his programmatic views or his political views. But one of the other things they would discuss is that Garvey, as a result of getting the resolutions from the International Conference on the Negro at Tuskegee and understanding the laying out of the 44 industries and the perfecting of the Tuskegee model to be exported to the African world, it is then that Garvey writes to Washington that he has created an organization and he has modeled it after the Tuskegee model.
Yes.
He sends him a letter stating this, and he sends him a pamphlet showing his outline and establishment of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And he sends those things, those items to Booker T. Washington, and they are still in the Booker T. Washington papers, this correspondence, as well as the pamphlet that Garvey sent him, modeling the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, after the Tuskegee model. So the concept of having multiple industries comes from the Tuskegee model and Washington. And Garvey essentially attempts to participate in this formation, right? Now, the only thing is this: while Garvey would try his hand at many industries, the only industry that he himself really perfected was and it's a great thing actually, was the printing press. And yes, Tuskegee had its own printing press as well, as you saw in the quote where they said they print in their own textbooks, you know. That being said, Garvey had perfected the printing press, and it would be single handedly through his mastery of this particular industry that he would be able to organize the African world in a way that has never been organized before or since, right? What do I mean by that? He would establish a paper called the Negro World. And with that paper, he would make sure that that paper would end up in every dock and port where African people were, internationally and in the Americas. So everywhere you can imagine in the Americas, in the United States, 47 chapters of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, but more importantly, throughout the world. He would have a very interesting network with people like Muhammad Ali, who was Egyptian born but also reside in Nigeria, where he distributed his paper, the African Times and Orient Review, and he also distributed Marcus Garvey's paper. They were not in competition. They were allies. They weren't in competition, they were in collusion, right? They were working together for the advancement of African people. And so Muhammad Ali would distribute uh, Garvey's paper in Nigeria. So in every dock and port where there were African people, you found the Negro world. And it would prove to be a great organizing tool for us at that time. Okay.
Yes.
I'll stop right there. But one of the things I would say is that, so, Garvey brings us into a little further into contemporary times, where you see the Tuskegee model manifesting in the format of an organization. Um, but they very much had the same ideological undercurrent: race pride, self help, all of those things. And so, it's interesting that people very often will be critical of Booker T. Washington, who was forced in many instances to function behind the scenes, and not even associate him with a Marcus Garvey. Just not final words on Marcus Garvey, but just some important points to know. Washington would inspire Garvey. Washington would provide the model that Garvey would perpetuate in the form of the UNIA. Washington would be the person who invited Garvey to the United States in the years that they communicated from 1912 to 1915. And Booker T. Washington would defeat a very important piece of legislation that would have kept Marcus Garvey out of the United States, called the African Exclusion Measure in 1915. And so the very next year in 1916, Garvey is able to immigrate into the United States 4 months after Booker T. Washington died, right? So they are never able to meet. But on many levels, Washington is almost wholly, or if you wanted to be modest, partly responsible um, for, well, I can't even say partly. I mean, he has a significant role in the advent of uh, Marcus Garvey coming to the United States, um, coming to the United States to plant the seed of the UNIA, and also in challenging the U.S. legislation that would have kept Garvey out of the United States conclusively, right? Just a couple of months before his arrival. So I'll leave it there, because I don't, you might want me to go back and focus on some other things, but I would love to, because I would want to get into a little bit about Carver, and when Carver comes and what that means for Tuskegee as a sustainable model.
Yes. One of the things in speaking about Carver, um, his archives housed over 25,000 letters to his
Mhm,
students.
mhm.
Everybody who wrote Carver would answer those letters,
Oh,
and
wow.
he would answer them, "My dear son."
Oh,
And most of
wonderful.
the letters that would be written to him would be written to him, "My dear daddy." Um, and so he had a personal relationship with almost every student,
Yes.
and they would write him about answers to questions and so forth. Of course, um, uh, Booker T was just an amazing humanitarian, and he had this ability to be one with nature. He was a great artist, you know. He he loved to go out into the woods and paint and talk to the plants and get all kinds of information. That's how he was able to save the South from the boll weevil. Um,
Hmm.
he he literally, they would ask him, "You're telling me that you can talk to plants?" And he would say, "Well, I uh, I didn't have this information when I went to the woods, but I have the information now. Who do you think taught it to me?" And
Hmm.
so he was always one with nature. And when Henry Ford, when Booker T had a fall uh, in his home. Henry Ford had an elevator built in the home of Booker T, of George Washington Carver, so he could go up and down the steps. But everybody knows that everybody picked George Washington Carver's mind. He was
Yes.
he was free and open, and they could find answers to almost any question
Right.
they could ask him, and it's just amazing. And again, that's why Henry Ford tried everything he could do to be around Carver and to pick Carver's mind. And he would have paid Carver. He had no problem paying Carver. But that was not what he was about. So what he told Ford was that he would help him set up uh, the distribution and everything about the uh, Ford Car Company, but he wanted him to hire black men, and so that's what Ford did. He hired black men, and he paid them relatively good salaries, so all of them could then buy cars. So it worked out
Okay.
that that black men got a pretty good salary, and they all had cars back in the days.
Right.
I
Right.
I can remember my all the brothers in my family. I mean, uh, my mother was born in 1915. That's the year that Booker T died.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And we were sharecroppers. We so all of the things that George Washington Carver was teaching about sharecropping and everything, I experienced all that
Right.
uh, growing up.
Right.
And we were you talk about black folk back then. We were extremely independent. We managed to buy the land that we sharecropped. And there were four families: the Browns, the McDowells, the Montgomerys, and the Reeds. And those four families married into each other.
Mm-hmm.
All of them were able to buy the plantations that, well, they were all able to get the land that they sharecropped.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
really, we ended up with about 1,000 acres of land. We
Mm-hmm.
built our own schools and churches and helped each other. And up until this day, we still have family reunions. I mean,
Right.
like 300-400 of us used to come together every year in
Mm-hmm.
South Carolina, Lancaster, for family reunion, and we stayed that way until
Where in South Carolina? Lancaster?
yeah,
Okay. I know some people from there recently who just said, I know some people who recently said that that was, yeah, where their
yeah,
family's from as well. Okay.
yeah. It's and they have another tradition that's called camp meet. Everybody that was
Yeah,
born
I
there,
know about that.
yeah, they once a year around September they all come back to that town
Yes.
together. So it has a history that uh, has not left us. We're still there, and that history goes all the way back to Booker
Right.
T. You know,
Right. Right.
so yeah, I just enjoy talking to you because when you start talking, you start bringing forth memories.
Yes.
You know,
So I did want to share one thing. You were talking about commemorating George Washington Carver, and I do want to note that a lot of people may not know this, but there was a U.S. minted coin, and I have one, but I didn't take it out for this. Maybe next time. There's I believe it's a 50-cent coin or maybe $1. I'm not sure, but it's George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. And notably, the year it was a limited edition U.S. minted coin, so it is legitimate. It's so funny because I knew this guy who was on a history show and would, gather historical artifacts, and I showed him it, and he couldn't tell me anything. He told me it was like fake, actually, um, and come to find out, it's real. They did one for Booker T. Washington and one for who? None other than George Washington Carver. The year that these coins were minted were 1946. So when
Yes,
people are talking about, oh, we've never had it, we put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill or this, that, and the other. So Washington, both Washingtons, Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver, would both be on U.S. minted coins in 1946. And there's a handful of them produced. It's not that hard to get your hands on them. I do have one of each. And I don't know what they're worth at this point now, but they are definitely a collector's item. So there was a commemoration of both of them in that respect, okay, by the U.S. government for whatever it's worth, right? But and I'm not placing a whole lot of value on that, only because if you know about George Washington Carver and his many inventions, you know that the U.S. government stole his patents, and he was never a wealthy man as a result of that. Now, he did okay at Tuskegee, as Tuskegee provided all that he needed: a home, a space to work. He had a very simple life as a result of, some things that happened to him early on in life. So he never married, he never had children. His students, as you are correct about, he considered his students his children. Okay. And so, and that's, to me, I can understand that as an educator, right? I not only can understand that as an educator, I had that kind of relationship with my professors at Tuskegee as well. So, side note about me for those who might not know, I do this work and I wrote this book. I'll put the book up about Booker T. Washington in Africa. I don't know. There's a lot of light here.
I can see it.
Okay, so you can see it. I wrote this book about Booker T. Washington in Africa. However, I'm a historian, but I'm also a Tuskegee alumni. I always forget to say that because and then the people who know that, sometimes they assume that you've done this work because you are an alumni, and it's certainly, that's not the case, right? I was called to do this work, but it certainly was not what I set out to do per se. Meaning, like, it fell into my lap, so to speak, and I was well positioned to do it. As far as knowing some intimate details, and having access to certain people and insight to some issues that one would need to have in terms of conjuring some historical facts and things, and having access to uh, the information as well. So, but George Washington Carver would take things at Tuskegee to another level, right? And he comes on board. I have just put the page. He comes aboard, I believe, in 1896.
Yeah,
And yes, he comes aboard in 1896. So the sustainability model was expanded in 1896 when Booker T. Washington invited George Washington Carver to join the Tuskegee faculty as head of the agricultural department. In spite of the lack of funds, Carver still accepted the offer, transformed the department, and impacted the agrarian practices at Tuskegee and in the larger Macon County community. Carver introduced subsistence farming, and taught many how to alternate crops in order to avoid soil depletion. The peanut, tomatoes, and sweet potatoes were all at the core of some of his inventions. Carver's methods were taught throughout Macon County with the use of the Tuskegee Mobile School, which traveled to farmers in rural areas. Um, so there was there was a lot going on at Tuskegee. Um, you know, one of the things that is important and to give context to is the fact that, George Washington Carver is engaging in, subsistence farming practices, meaning showing farmers how to produce enough for themselves and for the market, but also methods in, soil replenishment, and how not to rape or deplete the soil, right? So, like, I was talking about this a few weeks ago with someone, like about Haiti, how you can see that Haiti has a scar on the land, right? Because it was over farmed. The land was essentially raped, right? So if you've ever flown over Haiti, you'll see that a large portion of the land is no longer arable, right? It's almost like it's just dirt, and it can't be cultivated again because that's what the French did to it. They overfarmed, right?
Yes.
Uh, so Carver was involved in engaging in practices and educating farmers, rural Macon County farmers, in practices that would prevent that, right? And just also just how to stay in line with the ecology, right? The ecosystem,
Correct. That's true.
not to be a parasitic force in the ecosystem, right? Which is sort of like the Western way, to just take and never put back in. And so he was teaching farmers in Macon County how to do something different. But notably, let me say this: Macon County, and I mentioned it a couple of times, Macon County is an all black or predominantly black county. Is a very and that is the county that Tuskegee is in. And so they have Notasulga is one of the other communities there. Shorter is also in a community there, but predominantly it is in the Black Belt. Okay, and however, they are closed in on both sides by white counties. Okay, and so it was very important that what Tuskegee was doing was also shared with the larger Macon County community, because this institution and all that it would bring to that community was really a production of the community. I skipped over the story of Lewis Adams, but Lewis Adams is a formerly enslaved African person who survived it, who survived slavery, to come and be leadership in Tuskegee, Macon County, and then have enough leverage to be in the position to organize the black vote for the incumbent Senator Foster at the time. When this is around 1881, around the time of Tuskegee's founding, because it is Foster that comes to Lewis Adams and says, "Could you organize the black vote in my favor?" Lewis Adams does that, and when he is successfully re-elected, he comes back to Lewis Adams and says, "What would you like?" And this man who had survived the institution of slavery, okay, nobody's more deprived than someone who has lived through enslavement and the Civil War. This man did not say anything that would have been beneficial to himself individually. He said, instead, I want a school for my people. And that is the birth of Tuskegee Institute. And it was officially called, chartered as the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee. That would existed in a one-room AME church. And so that gesture on the part of Foster to fulfill Lewis Adams' request allowed for a $2,000 allotment to the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee for teachers only, meaning the $2,000 were to pay was for teachers' salaries only. No structure, right? They didn't give them any money for their own building. They didn't give them any money for resources, materials, not even for wood to keep warm in the one room church when they did have class. None of that, nothing. Just $2,000 a year for teacher salaries. That being said, it would be a young Booker T. Washington who would be uh, summoned from Hampton Institute, who would essentially build the institution from that one room school in the AME church to what it would be in his time. And in 1893, he would make the institution independent from the state of Alabama. You mentioned Ford several times. Booker T. Washington in 1893, having already known Ford himself, he would tell the state of Alabama to keep their money. He knew he could raise more money on the road with Ford. And so he would establish it's the institution's new charter, an independent charter. He would take it back from the state of Alabama, okay, and become independent. So Tuskegee has two charters in 1881. That's the one we always celebrate. If those of us people who know about Tuskegee know, we always wear hats that say 1881. That's the original founding. But in 1893, Washington would make the institution independent of the state of Alabama, which was a major move on his part. And so today, even today, Tuskegee has a very unique classification as quasi private. It is private and independent and state affiliated when it needs to be, which is a very notable mark of Booker T. Washington. He knew how to maneuver in such a way that it would be to our benefit, right? So that's what he does. He makes the institution independent of the state of Alabama. And George Washington Carver is part of that independence, as shortly after 1893, and then George Washington Carver comes in 1896. Now, unfortunately, Carver's dealings with the U.S. government were not as successful because they would ultimately take all of his patents. And the details of that, I do not know all of the details on it, so I will not speak on it. But I do know for a historical fact, his inventions, we can list all of them. Most of his inventions he did not have a patent for. Today you can see all of his inventions at the George Washington Carver Museum on the campus of Tuskegee University. So they're undeniable. Nobody denies all of his many, many, many inventions and his extraordinary ability to cross breed and produce new strands of any given thing. Okay, just a
That's critical.
yeah,
To
master
produce
agriculturalist.
yeah, to produce cross strands of
Right,
just about anything.
right, and
That's
this is
what made him the genius.
right, and this would be notable because later on in some scenarios that you would see happen that involve international situations that involve in Tuskegee, what people are coveting is the agricultural ingenuity that is coming out of Tuskegee, this ability to crossbreed and just this mastery of the agricultural realm, that many people, whether it was in the production of cotton or anything else. So,
Well, while we're speaking of anything else, um, George Washington Carver during World War II was actually able to make rubber tires for the U.S. government to fight in the war because they didn't have enough rubber coming out of Liberia. So he could make rubber from peanuts
mm,
that was strong enough to drive cars on. And
wow.
it's just amazing.
Well, I didn't know that.
Well, he was so respected that uh, they they named the Navy named I think two or three ships after George Washington Carver. Now that's but we don't know that. We as a people we do not know who this man was, and
Right.
that's why Ford said he was the greatest mind in the world. He didn't say in America. He said he was the greatest mind in the world.
Right. 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 I do want to share the image of let's see if we can get it. So here is the um
Oh yeah, the truck, the
so this
teaching.
is the truck through which they would share all of the methods. And it's called the Booker T. Washington School on Wheels,
Yes,
right? Agricultural School on Wheels. And so
and
this
you
is
can
the
still
vehicle.
get.
This vehicle is still at the Carver Museum at
Yes, I've been
Tuskegee.
there.
And it inside, yes, it essentially is like a replica of a small classroom. And they
Yes,
would use this to go out into, as I stated before, Macon County, to the rural farmers of Macon County and share and bring them into this vehicle, which is essentially a school on wheels. Um, and this is how they would share all of these practices that were being studied and perfected at Tuskegee on the actual campus. And this is how it was shared with the larger Macon County community. Okay. So
yes,
very important because um, in general, this idea of usefulness to one's own people comes up consistently with us. And that is the sort of the idea, not sort of, it is the idea of and mission of Tuskegee, that both domestic and international students would go back to their community and establish themselves and carry out this sort of sacred mission that Tuskegee had. But also this idea of how one has to be useful or could be useful, meaning that the very idea of Tuskegee also was that there was no one who could come to the institution and not become useful to their people. The strength of the institution was that it could make anyone useful to our people, right?
yes,
An asset to our people. And so, I do understand now as an adult that for some people, this is a foreign concept that whatever you do, you must, that you should do it for your own people first and foremost. And sure, you can share your talents with the world, but you must do it for your people as well. When I was at Tuskegee and clearly going all the way back to its inception, this was a conscious and deliberate concept that was inculcated in the student population. Okay.
yes.
So I was always a history major as during my time at Tuskegee as a student, and I do remember, and we're all required to take history. Uh, but I can remember being in the classroom with aerospace engineers and all kinds of scientists, as Tuskegee is very strong in the sciences. Uh, but our history teacher would say, who are you going to do whatever you're doing for? Who are you going to do it for?
Correct.
Right? So when they would tell, he would say, so and so, you're a hotshot aerospace engineer major. Now, who are you going to build that plane for? Right? So, the question of who does one serve once one has mastered some skills. And so that, and I'm not saying everybody will goes to Tuskegee, uh, you know, fulfills the sacred mission. I'm just saying that there was a conscious and programmatic effort to and impress this upon the students that came through there, be it domestic or international students, right? And so the truck, right, the school on wheels, and the reaching out to the community as a result of as in terms of sharing practices that were perfected at the institute were all a part of this, right? This human ecosystem,
Yes.
so to speak. Hmm.
Oh, wow. And believe it or not, we have not even scratched the surface
No, no,
of
no,
what
no.
we do.
Well, we're hitting an hour. I don't have too much more time. So, are there some specifics that you would like me to talk about?
Um, I'd like for you to promise that you will come back again.
Sure, sure,
Give me
sure.
another
I
hour.
will. Sure, I will come back again. Let me read a quote. So I'm sure people would like to they want a little controversy.
Okay.
So let me give you some interesting information about what was going on with Booker T. Washington. So you guys know about how there was, people have vendettas and issues with other human beings. We know now, everything in this day and age is on social media. So back then, when people had grievances or conflicts or whatever, it was more than likely printed in the press, right? The written press in some newspaper. And this is how people would communicate largely with the masses of people, um, one way or another. Well, one of Booker T. Washington's major adversaries at the time was a man named Thomas Dixon. And I think I probably talked about this when I came on your show before. Thomas Dixon was the infamous author of a book named The Klansman. The Klansman is a book about rallying the Ku Klux Klan and rallying white men in protection of white women. This book will go on to inspire a very infamous film called The Birth of a Nation and
Yes.
would air in 1900 or 1901. It was a major production during its time. It was meant to rally the Klan for the second time in history after its founding. Uh, this period that it is being conjured once again is during a period called the Nadir, Nadir. It means our lowest point in terms of the African American existence. And why is it referred to as that? It is referred to as the Nadir 1895 to 1915 because it was one of the most violent periods in U.S. history. And it would be argued by our president,
Yes. Go
in
ahead.
the last 10, 15 years, you can find easily, several people being gunned down by extensions of the state in some form or fashion. Unarmed black people being mowed down, shot, killed by extensions of the state, local, right? Local or state officials being, the police or, persons in that in paramilitary organizations, right? Uh, that being said, Birth of a Nation would rally the Klan for a second time. And Thomas Dixon who wrote the book that inspired the film, had an ongoing vendetta with Booker T. Washington. He felt as though Booker T. Washington thoroughly had white Americans, particularly white Southerners, fooled. And he was very angry about it. Uh, he essentially was saying that this guy that you think is so sterile, that's so non threatening, is doing a whole lot more than you think he is. And the irony of it is that uh, Thomas Dixon tried to air Booker T. Washington out in the press through an article he wrote, and I'll give you an excerpt from that article. He was trying to essentially blow Washington up to the masses of white Americans and say, like, watch this guy, he's dangerous. He believed that so much that he named the article Booker T. Washington and the Negro, Some Dangerous Aspects of the Work of Tuskegee.
Wow.
Okay. It was published in the Saturday Evening Post, Philadelphia, in August of 1905. And it's volume 178 for those of you who want to find this. It's so funny because I haphazardly got my hands on this article. I didn't even know it exists. And then, well, I won't get into the whole story, but a physics professor at Tuskegee who also has a business in Tuskegee brought me up to his old library, so to speak, and pulled out this article while I was there researching for this book. But this is a piece, excerpt from that article written by Thomas Dixon, who, like I said, had an ongoing vendetta with Booker T. Washington because he was angry that Washington was so efficient at hiding his face in the public realm, so to speak, and doing something very different behind the scenes. The question for us is this true or not, what Thomas Dixon was saying? So he wrote, Mr. Washington is not training Negroes to take their place in any industrial system of the South in which the white man directs or controls him. He is not training his students to be servants and come at the beck and call of any man. He is training them all to be masters of men, to be independent, to own and operate their own industries, to plant their own fields, buy and sell their own goods, and in every shape and form destroy the last vestige of dependence on the white man for anything. Every pupil who passes through Mr. Washington's hands ceases forever to work under a white man. Not only so, but he goes forth trained as an evangelist to preach the doctrine of separation and independence. So, what I do in my work is try to see if there is any truth in what Thomas Dixon is saying Washington is up to. And to my understanding, yes, there is some interesting truth to it. He is not. For those who study this history, you know that the Tuskegee mission and model to many in many instances is independence, right? Independent, own and operate, independence through industry.
Yes.
So if one was to think of Washington as a Pan-Africanist because he is particularly interested in implementing this for African people as a result of our condition, so that would put him in the Pan-Africanist realm, aside of the other stuff. I mean, if you guys are interested in the book, Mr. Brown, you can put the link of the book, even though I don't have a lot of books on hand and there are some floating around. So you can put the link for a book, but I might have to pause if people like are, really in the buying energy because we sold out most of this summer and there's another version of the book coming out which is revised and expanded. And so I really wasn't big on pushing this version, the original version of the book, which is good, but we're moving on. Anyway, the point is that Thomas Dixon would go on to understand that Tuskegee is engaging in practices where one.
Excuse me, doctor. What is the link so I can put it in the chat?
Okay, it's Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. It's all one word, Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. Okay. Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. And if you go to the last page, you can actually purchase the book. But that being said, so I set out to understand whether or not if there's any truth in what Thomas Dixon is saying. And yes, Washington's particular brand of Pan-Africanism as it is implemented at Tuskegee is independence through industry. But he doesn't just stop there. He is interested in exporting this concept of independence through industry to the African world, so much to the degree that when he is involved in the Liberian crisis, one of the recommendations he gives Liberian officials is to stop consuming Western goods. Period. He says loosely, every time a Liberian person opens a can in Liberia, you seal the fate of Liberians in poverty. In other words, consume what you produce. Don't consume their stuff. Consume what you produce. Produce what you consume.
Correct.
Okay? And so, yes, there is some truth to what Thomas Dixon is saying. But to show you the power of propaganda on so many levels, Washington had so many white Americans convinced that he was sterile. Even an article like that published in the Saturday Evening Post in Philadelphia, airing Washington out, delineating his program and saying that this program is great, but it should be exported to Liberia because white people are never going to allow Black people to be on par with them in this country.
That's correct.
And so, even though Thomas Dixon aired him out, publicly exposed him, it had no impact on him that I could find. And that tells you a lot. Either white Americans needed or wanted to believe that he was sterile. In which case, either way, fine by us because it allowed him to go and do a great deal of work that would not have been done had he declared and announced what he was up to. And so just for people watching this, two of the things I started out saying, two of the major things that Booker T. Washington does with regard to policy and legislation in African affairs is one, he is directly involved in the preservation of Liberia, which the French, British, and German colonial forces had attempted to annex. And he was also directly involved in the debunking of something called the African Exclusion Measure, which was an amendment to the larger immigration bill of 1915, which conclusively was designed to exclude, I quote, anyone of the Black or African race from the United States forever, and put them in the same category as undesirables and criminals attempting to enter the country. And this would be directed at African and Black people coming from specifically the Caribbean who had just worked on the Panama Canal. But it would have conclusively impacted anybody coming to the United States who appeared black or was African in any way. Okay. And
Yes.
he is the sole um, factor in the defeat of that case. As I'll come back on another occasion and talk about the case, but I think I've done that on your channel before years ago now, like a couple of years ago, before the pandemic. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, Washington would defeat that measure using his Tuskegee machine, his secret network, which was sort of his real measure of power, this clandestine network that he utilized to um, power broker and execute things for Black people, both
Correct.
domestically and internationally. So extraordinary, very extraordinary. Mhm.
Sir, Dr. Wright, I
Mhm.
want to thank you. I know that you have other things to do tonight.
Yes, thank you
So
for having me.
I thank you and I thank Mama Moshe for being with us tonight. And it's just fantastic. It was
Thank,
fantastic.
thank you so much. Again, the link for the book is Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. I don't, well, if people want to order the book, that's fine. But you don't have to. There's a lot of information on the website that's related to this. And there's also a revised and expanded version of the book that'll be out in the latter part of the summer. It was written 4 years ago now, because this book is 7 years ago, 7 years old. So it's been out for a while. I can't even believe it's been that long, but um, it did very well. But there will be a revised and expanded version of the book that comes out in the latter part of the summer, and it's sort of geared towards a wider audience. Okay, you can't see me anymore because now there's a T-shirt. Okay, all right. Well, all right, I'm back. So thank you for inviting me, and I would love to come back and talk more about specifics. Maybe your audience can tell you, some of the specifics that they might want me to talk about with regard to Washington, Africa, and George Washington Carver. And by the way, Carver and Booker T. Washington are both buried on the campus of Tuskegee University at the highest point next to each other on top of that,
Yes,
right? So they
that's true. All
buried
right, we're going to let you go.
there.
Thank, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to coming back.